Hello everyone. Tonight we begin our journey into one of the most complex, disciplined and magnificent civilizations in human history, Imperial China. For over 2,000 years, this empire set the standard for science, philosophy, art, military and administration. But don't get carried away. While the Forbidden City may look magnificent from afar, living in it is a different story. Before we go any further, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you find this content worthwhile. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating to see people watching from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, turn on the fan for some extra relaxation, and join me on a journey into ancient China, where as soon as you're born, you're assigned a role by society, and then nailed to it. The social system here is like a multi-layered cake, but you are at the bottom, the driest part, never getting to taste the cream on top. At the top is the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, which sounds mighty until you realize that heaven never accepts complaints. He rules by the mandate of heaven. When the harvest is good and the people are peaceful, the mandate is still there. When there is chaos, it is a sign that heaven has changed its mind. It is time for a new dynasty. Below are the mandarins, people who spend their lives memorizing the 4 books and 5 classics, preferring philosophy to air, and are hunchbacked from hugging bamboo scrolls all their lives. They pass the civil service exams, SAT-style exams, but if they fail, they are poor forever. Next are the peasants, the backbone of society, who spend their lives in the mud and starving. Confucius respected them, but respect did not come with dental insurance or lunch breaks. Then there are the craftsmen, who make paper, pottery, fans, and all sorts of useful things, but who are not highly regarded. At least they are not merchants. Merchants, rich but despised. According to Confucianism, profiting from the labor of others is shady. Even if you wear silk and jewels, you are still considered a tax-evading rat wearing brocade. The bottom tier, soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, criminals, and monks, who are always asked why they are bald and barefoot in the streets. And last, women. They have no place in the social pyramid. They are the gravel around the base of the pyramid, born to obey their father, then their husband, and to give birth to sons to continue the chain of obedience. A new day in ancient China did not begin because you were a morning person, but because the rooster crowed and the village bells rang like a call to the soul. You woke up, stretched, and then remembered, you were not allowed to exist carefree. First thing, bow, not to the gods, but to your father, then your mother, then your grandfather, maybe even your gossiping aunt if she was still alive. This is called filial piety, not only encouraged, but required. Forgetting to bow? It's not rude, it's humiliating to the whole family. And you don't bow once, you bow in stages. When you wake up, before meals, when an elder coughs. If you haven't bowed at least 6 times before breakfast, you're not Chinese enough. Suppose you accidentally ask, "Why'd I have to wash your uncle's feet?" Congratulations, you've just committed an act of unfilial piety. Prepare to apologize with 3 bows, preferably touching your forehead to the ground. Your family is poor and doesn't have a chair, so you kneel on a mat, trying not to collapse while listening to a 45-minute moral lecture from an elder about the decline of society since the previous dynasty. Don't forget the Confucian hierarchy, the ranking of social power. Age greater than youth, male greater than female, father greater than all, youngest, just smile and hope you're not wrongly accused. After 47 bows, you are allowed to eat breakfast, the most important meal to remind you that life is suffering. A bowl of thin porridge, rice with boiling water, is lucky if it has salt, If it has pickles, then you are in great luck. Meat? Forget it. For weddings, New Year's or official ceremonies, eggs are allowed, but usually salted to the point of looking fossilized. Tea is offered, not for relaxation, but because the water is often unsafe. Eat in silence, facing the ancestral altar, thanking your ancestors for leaving you a thatched roof, anemia and the pressure of expectation. The bowl is rough pottery, the spoon is wooden, no towel. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve if your sleeve is clean. When the meal is over, the father nods, eat quickly. Heaven helps the diligent, that is, get to work. The dynasty awaits. Dress not for beauty, but for survival. Peasants, wear hemp, rough, itchy, like wearing sandpaper. Noble, silk, beautiful, shiny and expensive. Wearing the wrong material, not out of fashion, illegal. Yellow, for the emperor only. Try it on, and you'll be the one to open the execution. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk shoes for nobles. Pretty? No. Comfortable? No. And finally, foot binding. If you were a young lady, from the age of 5 your feet would be bound, bent, pressed, tied so tight that they formed continuous feet. Why? Because it was believed that the more painful it was, the more beautiful it became. Painful, permanent, foot binding devastated generations of women, turning walking into a performance of both art and torture. But don't worry, at least you'll get to wear beautifully embroidered shoes that no one will see, since you can barely walk very far. Men were no better off. Officials had to wear long, multi-layered robes all year round, even in the summer, because status was always more important than sweat. Some hats even had long flaps to prevent them from whispering in court. So that's ancient Chinese fashion, elegant, symbolic, and politically charged. But it was also a tool for suffocating, blistering, melting, even breaking the body. Here, pain wasn't the price of beauty, it was a legally sanctioned requirement. You're dressed right, in your legal itchy linen. Great, now go to work and earn a living, if the weather, the land, and the taxes allow it. Admit it. In feudal China, work was not a passion, but a never-ending physical test, designed by Confucius and enforced by officials who had never touched a hoe. As a farmer, which most people were, you spent your life hunched over rice paddies. Not in the romantic sense, but actually hunched over, wading through mud, getting attacked by mosquitoes as big as birds, and praying that the landlord wouldn't raise the rice tax this year. Rain, work, drought, more work, locusts appear, work and cry to the heavens. Tools? Wooden plow if you're lucky. Bare hands if not. The buffalo is your best friend and pensioner. Losing it, you face 10 acres of rice paddies with faith. As a woman, the chore list has a second part. In addition to the fields, you cook, do the laundry, weave, take care of the children, and still get blamed when dinner is late or your husband sneezes. Rest is the privilege of the lady reciting poetry in the garden. Craftsmen are no better. They sweat to make pottery, paper, forge knives, and sell them for just enough to buy rancid tofu. Merchants, rich, but despised by society, can buy half a village, but still considered a moral failure with money. And then there is the corvette, forced labor. Today the emperor needs roads, canals, mausoleums. Guess who will roll up their sleeves without pay, without shoes, and with a smile? Refuse? Traitor or criminal. At the end of the day, you drag yourself home in the dust, eat a bowl of thin porridge and tell yourself, at least today you are alive. In feudal China, labor did not liberate you. It left you too tired to rebel. Now comes the imperial examination, the gateway to advancement, or rather, China's never-ending intellectual torture chamber. As a man with some ambition in a not-so-poor family, your life is tied to the goal. Pass the exam, become an official, which means being respected, wearing silk, and having a seat. Fail? Go back to the fields. Obviously, right? Not at all. The exam is not a multiple-choice test, but memorizing the entire Confucian classics and writing an essay that would make a 1,000-year-old ghost cry. Write a wrong word, use a ridiculous metaphor, or have bad handwriting. Fail. Study from childhood until bald. Winter, shivering in a study tent. Summer, sweating in a hot room. Writing all day until your hands become claws holding a pen. Tutors forge you like swords. Social life? Gone. Hobbies? Confucius. Dreams? Still Confucius. The high-level exam, doctorate, held in the capital. Candidates are locked in a small room like a coffin, carrying food, blankets, and chamber pots. Some faint, some go crazy, some people died, really, and no one got extra points for that. Passing is not all. There are also district, provincial, national rounds. Some people took the exam until they were in their 60s. One man took the exam more than 40 times. That is not perseverance. It is psychological trauma of holding a brush. Failing? Shame on the whole family. Mother cries. Neighbors gossip. Father looks at you like, why weren't you born smarter? Passing is not fun either. Being exploited, low salary, eunuchs monitoring every stroke. Worth it? Just ask Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Not yet, because personal hygiene in ancient China was not a way of life. It was a seasonal suggestion. Bathing? Yes, sometimes. Summer, river bathing. Winter, maybe a month without washing thoroughly. Soap, animal fat mixed with ash, scrubbing like rubbing against sadness. There were public baths, but no privacy. You scrub your armpits next to an old cloth seller and a screaming child, while a monk recites poetry about cleanliness. Toothbrush, salt, charcoal or bone meal. Brush, animal hair tied to bamboo. Effectiveness, let's call it, mild plaque disrupting. Bad teeth, old people often smile like cursed Halloween pumpkins. Parasites? Yes, lice, bedbugs, not enemies, but housemates. Rich or poor, everyone gets them. A lice comb is the most common. Without one, you scratch your head like you're calling for thunder. Clothes? Go for weeks without washing. Washing clothes is a chore. Fetching water, boiling, hand washing, hoping the clothes don't disintegrate into powder. Underwear? Yes, but not everyone uses it. Farmers often don't wear them. Dangerous. And the latrines? Forget them. For your mental health. Usually holes in the ground, sometimes covered with wooden boards if high class. Public toilets? Like haunted wells. Smelly, crowded, and always on the brink of biological disaster. Ancient China had silk, poetry, philosophy and palaces. But if you want a hot shower in private, sorry, you've been lost for about 1,500 years. You survive lice, disappointing breakfasts and soul-destroying exams. But before you complain to your neighbors, remember, the law is always watching you here, not with cameras, but with bamboo sticks and creative punishments. To keep things fair, the court system had a variety of bamboo canes of varying sizes, because justice was best served by a custom-made beating. Say something a little rude? Small cane. Steal a chicken? Bigger cane. Forget to bow deep enough to the judge's horse? Surprise combo plate. For more serious crimes, things escalated faster than a royal palace play. You could be branded, yes, like cattle, with your crime on your face, exiled to the middle of nowhere, or, if you really screwed someone over, publicly executed, and not quickly either. Torture? Not a last resort, more like an opening act. The court didn't ask, "Are you done?" They asked, "Do you want to confess now, or after we break your kneecaps?" Confessions were encouraged through the ancient art of advanced persuasion. Thumb screws. Kneeling on spiked boards. Stressful postures that make yoga look benevolent. And the catch? You didn't even have to be guilty. Inconveniencing or standing too close to an unpopular person was often enough. The law loved collective punishment, so if your cousin muttered something treacherous after 2 cups of rice wine, you might find your house mysteriously surrounded at dawn. Because in feudal China, guilt could be hereditary. The legal system was organized, advanced, and downright terrifying. It wasn't about fairness. It was about compliance. The message was clear: sit down, be quiet, and never, ever flirt with the judge's concubine. Speaking of torture, not punishment, procedure. Accused of stealing chickens? Being rude to your dad? Making a slightly sarcastic comment on the emperor's poetry? You don't start with an excuse. You start tied to a bench while someone rolls out the official, "Get that confession, kit." Step 1. A bamboo whip to the back, thigh, or pride, whichever side breaks first. But don't worry, they count the lashes. Officials love paperwork. 30 lashes for stealing. 45 lashes for lying. Add another if you falter. Still in denial? Time to level up. Kneeling on nailed boards. Like yoga, if yoga were designed by petty government officials with anger issues. Finger crushers. 2 wooden boards squeezed together until your bones crackle like snack sticks. Adorably nicknamed, Little Tiger Chair. Less, cute animals, more, pain zoo. No, you probably can't write a confession with a broken finger. But legibility isn't the issue. The state just needs you to say the right thing, regardless of whether it's true or not. Still not confessing? Great. They've got more. Stretching. Whipping. Leaving you to suffer in the sun while the judge grabs lunch. Screaming? Never mind. The neighbors heard it all. Now imagine, you're innocent. Congratulations, you're still being tortured. Why? Because a neat confession keeps the paperwork neat. Better to admit something than to be labeled incooperative. Ah yes, the efficiency of the empire. So next time you complain to the DMV, remember, at least no one is there to whip you for filing the wrong form in 1372. You might think you're alone, but you're not. Welcome to Imperial China's surveillance state. No cameras, just neighbors, in-laws, and maybe your cat reporting everything. At the village level, there are baozhong, part mayor, part gossip, part spy. Everyone is encouraged to snitch. Your neighbor, informant. Your servant, informant. That quiet cousin you thought couldn't read? Surprise informant. Suspicious behavior includes hoarding too much rice, coughing during a royal ceremony, being too quiet, because it's obvious you're hiding something. In the cities, the government had messengers, secretaries, secret agents, and a whole lot of people pretending to help while remembering your every word. And in the imperial palace, the eunuchs entered, unmarried, but capable of political coups. They ran their own spy network, had direct access to the emperor, and could ruin careers with a whisper. Criticizing the emperor? Even a line like, "The sun looks tired," could get you beheaded for metaphorical treason. Poets became subtle. Everyone else kept quiet. The government even published execution lists, full names, crimes, punishments. Like an old Facebook page, but with more beheadings. Got a rebellious thought? Keep it to yourself. Rebellious cousin? Report him. Someone laughs too hard when asking for your opinion. Pretend to cough and run. Because in ancient China, even your bowl of rice could be heard. Imagine this. You gather a few disaffected peasants, burn the tax books, and shout for justice. 3 days later, the imperial army arrives, with crossbows, horses, and no sense of humor. To them, you are not just a rebel. You are a threat to the stability of the universe. In Confucian thought, rebellion means chaos, and chaos is a sign of a disordered universe. And that is not tolerated. You are arrested, executed, and it does not stop with you. Your neighbors, your family, even the person who lent you a hoe, are implicated. The government leaves no roots that can sprout again. And yet, rebellions break out, from the yellow turbans to the white lotus. They are crushed, enslaved, silenced forever, or sent to a place where they die before they can complete the works they were forced to build. Even talking about rebellion is a crime. A poem with the wrong metaphor can also lead to death. So you decide not to be a rebel peasant, but to pass the imperial examinations and become an official. But the imperial court is not a safe place. It is a maze of flattery, jealousy, and intrigue. Just mispronouncing the emperor's name, or kneeling a step too slowly, is considered treason. The eunuchs hold the keys to power. The concubines are political warriors, where every smile carries a hidden dagger. The empress has power? Try managing 30 jealous and ambitious women. You have avoided famine, paid your taxes, memorized Confucius, survived 3 purges, only to realize you are just a number in the tax book. Not a person, not a soul, just a grain of rice to measure output, a back to carry bricks. Feudal China was great, but also extremely cruel. Every elegant stroke of calligraphy is the shadow of thousands of people buried in the mud. Every brilliant roof tile is the crystallization of sweat, blood, and silence. The system works, but not because it is good. It convinces people that suffering is the natural order. So, no, you cannot survive a day in imperial China. Not because you are weak, but because it was not built for people to live in, only for empires to survive. In 1846, when the dream of the American West still burned in the hearts of thousands of families, a small group of about 30 men set out from Illinois, carrying faith, hope, and primitive wagons. Led by brothers George and Jacob Donner, along with James F. Reed, an ambitious businessman, they were not professional explorers, nor were they reckless gold hunters. They were farmers, craftsmen, fathers, mothers, and children, all headed for a promised land. California, painted with images of fertile valleys, temperate climates, and a new beginning. Their timing seemed ideal. Winter was still far away, and thousands of men had gone before them along the Oregon Trail, leaving footprints to guide them. But their trust in the promise of a shorter journey led them to disaster. When the party reached Fort Bridger in Wyoming, a fateful decision was made to leave the safe route and follow a proposed shortcut, the Hastings Shortcut, promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never actually traveled the route. Hastings promised a faster route, cutting through the rugged Wasatch Range and the scorching Great Salt Lake Desert. He left encouraging notes on trees and markers, like death threats. Trusting the writings, the Donner Party, now nearly 90 strong, veered off the main trail. At first, morale was high. Evening carols rang out, children played, and adults held out hope for a brighter future on the Pacific coast. But things quickly turned to nightmare. The Wasatch Range was not just a mountain range, but a steep, treacherous, tangled maze. The wagons had to be disassembled, hand-hauled over the mountains, and reassembled. Their fatigue mounted, their tempers grew, and their supplies dwindled. And then they came to the Great Salt Lake Desert, a glittering salt flat, blindingly white and deadly. Hastings had said it would take 2 days to cross. It was actually 5 days in the scorching sun. Water ran out, cattle died, men abandoned wagons, baggage, and hope to continue. By the time they rejoined the main trail, weeks had passed. Other parties had crossed the Sierra Nevada before the snows fell. The Donners had not. They were slow, exhausted, and unaware that their most terrible ordeal lay ahead. In late October, they finally reached the eastern foot of the Sierra Nevada. Before them lay the towering, snow-capped peaks, the last barrier between them and California. But winter had come early. Snow began to fall, at first a thin white mist, then a wall of ice that buried every road. The passes became impassable. They were trapped in the cold and unforgiving wilderness. At Truckee Lake, later named Donner Lake in memory, they built huts of logs and wagon planks. Another group stopped further down at Alder Creek. They killed the last of their animals. They used the hides to make tents, boiled water for leather belts, ate strips of rawhide. Hunger did not come in a rush, but quietly, patiently, like a stalking predator. Children bit the blankets. Adults gnawed the bark. Every morning, another cold body. They were no longer migrants. They were prisoners of the white snow. Death came without warning. Fathers were helpless. Mothers tried to lull their children to sleep with trembling voices. Hope vanished with the faint light that filtered through the gaps in the tents. Then, on November 12th, a massive blizzard marked the end of all roads. Snow rose to the roofs. Trees were down. The Sierra Pass was buried. And with it, the California dream vanished. Instead, there was only one thing left: survival. In mid-December, with no hope of rescue, 15 of the fittest 10 men, 5 women, decided to risk their lives. They strapped on primitive snowshoes, gathered their meager rations, and set out on the most desperate journey in American immigration history. The group became known as the Forlorn Hope. They would cross the mountains on foot, through ice, deep snow, and darkness, to find salvation for those left behind, for the children, friends, loved ones waiting in cold huts where the line between life and death blurred. Little did they know that, ahead, they would face the most terrible choices humanity has ever faced. Camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the fallen hope, the question wasn't if they would survive. It was who would die first and who would eat them. On December 16, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope, not by the newspapers, but by their fellow immigrants who watched them go, knowing full well what the word forlorn meant. Lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could. scraps of dried oxhide, flint, a rifle, and shredded blankets. They built crude snowshoes, hoping to stay above the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They slogged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days, they were lost. The food ran out almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, a pine cone boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest in the group, his daughters sobbed as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonio, the Mexican teamster. Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious. Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death came not as a storm, but as a slow hush. It was silent, white, inescapable. Then came the moment the line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved meat from their fallen companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It wasn't savagery. It was calculus. Starve or live. Sarah Graves, just 19, later recalled the first taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Mary Ann Graves held her sister's hand and whispered that it didn't matter what they had to do so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived. 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought something far more powerful than supplies or maps. They brought news. There were dozens still alive, trapped at Donna Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they needed help now. California, which had largely ignored the Donna mess, suddenly woke up. The horror was too great, the shame too large. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper, and in the cabins by the lake, what they would find was beyond imagining. The first rescue party arrived at Donna Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the fall hope emerged from the mountains. What they found wasn't a camp. It was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, doors frozen shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Children lay beside their dead parents. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood, and the smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, spoke of what had happened when the meat ran out. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had started the journey, nearly half were dead. And those still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt skeletal figures wrapped in filthy hides, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescuers had brought supplies, flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to carry dozens through snowdrifts taller than wagons. They had to make impossible decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest, those with the greatest chance of surviving the trek back down the mountains. Parents stayed behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, unsure if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. Each had to battle whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had swallowed the Donna party whole. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors and darker stories. The truth began to leak out, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism. Of how, in the worst nights, when all was lost, some survivors had fed on the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to feed. The names were kept quiet, the rumors louder than the facts. Some were judged, others pied. Most were simply too traumatized to speak. James Reed, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him. She stayed behind when the others left and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over. But the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, twisting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. America, gripped by manifest destiny fever, was suddenly staring at its shadow. The story was too irresistible. Pioneers chasing paradise turned cannibals in the snow. Some headlines called it the cannibal horror of the Sierra. Others accused survivors of murder. It wasn't just scandal, it was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, and inevitable. But now it was stained with the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pinewood fires. Journalists fixated on every ghastly detail. Who ate whom? Who died nolly and who took too long to die? Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was sounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame, praised for surviving, yet judged for how they did it. James Reed, once a disgraced exile, returned to San Jose a changed man, haunted but vindicated. His leadership during the rescue missions earned him public sympathy, and he spent much of his later life trying to protect the reputations of the survivors, but even he couldn't silence the whispers. Tamsin Donna became a tragic symbol, a devoted wife who stayed behind with her dying husband, refusing rescue more than once. When she finally tried to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate was murky. Some said she died of cold. Others suggested she had been killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government, for its part, said little. California was on the brink of becoming U.S. territory, and the last thing officials wanted was to tarnish the dream of westward expansion. The incident was brushed aside as an unfortunate tragedy, an anomaly, no inquiry, no formal investigation. And yet, in every parlor and saloon, people talked about the donors. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Children were warned, don't take shortcuts, don't stray from the trail or you might end up like them. But beneath the horror, something more complex lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and just how thin the veneer of civilization really is when the snow won't stop falling. For those who lived through the Sierra nightmare, the journey didn't end when the snow melted. Survival came at a price. Etched into bone and memory, the survivors emerged from the mountains, but they never truly left them behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, underfed, wide-eyed. Some, like Virginia Reed, just 13 at the time, would go on to live long lives. She eventually married, had children, and even published letters recounting her ordeal. But beneath her composed surface lay trauma that pulsed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her entire family, married young and died within a few years. Louis Kesserberg, a German immigrant who had been among the last rescued, was branded forever by rumors that he had not only consumed the dead, but murdered them to do so. He sued a newspaper for libel and won $1 in damages. It didn't matter. The stain never left him. Some survivors tried to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to speak about what happened. Others couldn't stop talking, haunted not just by what they'd done, but by what they'd seen others do. It wasn't just the cannibalism. It was the slow unraveling of humanity. Watching friends wither into skeletons. Hearing the silent weeping of mothers who could no longer feed their children. Choosing who to save when rescue came because there was never room for all. Communities too reacted differently. Some treated the survivors with pity and respect, acknowledging their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, eager to distance themselves from what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier myth. James Reed, to his credit, rebuilt his reputation. He served in the 0 hours 55 minutes and 7 seconds Mexican-American War, prospered in San Jose, and lived to an old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, stayed with him, always. No one who survived the Donner Party returned unchanged. Whether they were 8 or 80, they had stared into the void of desperation and made choices most people pray they'll never face. And in that silence between hunger and horror, they left behind a truth few wanted to admit. Survival is not always clean. It is not always noble. Sometimes it simply means living with what you had to become. The Sierra Nevada never forgot the donors. The lake where many of them waited out the blizzards where they died, starved, and fed is now known as Donner Lake, a postcard of natural beauty with a name that hums with unease. Over time, the landscape became part of the legend. Tourists came to see the site where the cabins once stood, to walk the snowy trails where the forlorn hope had trudged, to gaze at the mountains that had refused to let the pioneers pass. Locals told stories. Some whispered that the place was cursed, that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the lake. On top stands a solemn pioneer family, father, mother, and child, facing westward, ever hopeful. The pedestal beneath them is 22 feet tall, marking the height of the snow that winter. It's a monument to endurance, to tragedy, to the thin line between civilization and survival. But even in stone, the story remains uneasy. The monument says nothing of cannibalism, nothing of the quiet desperation, the betrayals, or the dead who were consumed to keep others alive. It's a sanitized memory, one designed for public comfort, not historical truth. Every year, school children visit the site. They hear the basic version. Pioneers, trapped, survived. Maybe a mention of starvation. Rarely the rest. It's easier to honor grit than to stare into the face of what survival cost. Still, the mountains remember the paths they took are still there, buried under ski resorts and hiking trails. The spot where Tams and Donna stayed behind with her dying husband. Now a picnic area, the frozen cabin where children wept in silence, replaced by interpretive plaques. And yet the air feels heavy, as if the ground still holds the memory of boots crunching over snow, of mothers rocking dead infants, of strangers sharing meat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature doesn't care. It offers no apologies. But the story persists, not just because it's horrifying, but because it's human. The Donner Party wasn't just about failure or cannibalism. It was about how far people will go to protect their families, to cling to hope, to choose life, even in its most terrible form. And in the silence of the mountains, that choice still echoes. In the decades that followed, the story of the Donner Party evolved, warped by memory, distorted by gossip, and reshaped by the needs of a nation addicted to drama. The facts were gruesome enough, but that didn't stop storytellers from making them worse, or in some cases, more heroic. Some survivors were romanticized, cast as tragic pioneers who had faced hell and returned with scars. Others like Louis Kayserberg became villains in the public imagination. He was accused of hoarding food, of murdering Tams and Donna, of enjoying what he had to do to survive. None of these accusations were proven. But truth in the age of printing presses and dime novels was never the priority. The public loved extremes. They didn't want nuance. They wanted either martyrs or monsters. This made life after survival difficult. Every interview, every newspaper sketch, every fictional retelling reopened wounds. Some survivors tried to set the record straight. Virginia Reed years later published her own account. She begged future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and listen to those with experience. Others stayed silent, worn down by the weight of their memories and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had become folklore. Campfire stories told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale taught To school children, a metaphor for poor planning, for hubris, for what happens when people trust the wrong advice. The Hastings CFF became infamous, a synonym for fatal shortcuts. And over time, the true horror of the story, the cannibalism, was used to mask the deeper tragedy. That the entire ordeal could have been prevented. That bad leadership, arrogant promises, and systemic inexperience killed more people than snow ever did. Yet, there's something uniquely American in how the tale persisted. It's not just a story of 1 hour 0 minutes and 40 seconds failure. It's a story of obsession, with movement, with reinvention, with the fantasy of taming nature and destiny. The Donner Party was a mirror reflecting not just desperation, but the myth of westward perfection cracking under its own weight. The truth is there were no heroes, no villains, just humans making impossible choices. And while the snow melted and time marched forward, the question never truly faded. What would you have done today? The Donner Party stands as more than a footnote in American history. It's a symbol distorted, debated, and deeply uncomfortable. Unlike other tales of pioneering grit, this one refuses to sit neatly in the gallery of noble westward expansion. It's a story that still bites. We remember the cannibalism, yes, but that was only the final act. The real legacy lies in everything that led to it. The illusion of shortcuts, the fatal power of poor leadership, the faith placed in maps drawn by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party exposed the fragility of the American dream when tested against the harsh indifference of nature. And yet, in that collapse, we also find something else. Endurance. The survivors didn't just make it down from the mountains. They rebuilt, married, had children. Some stayed in California. Others moved away to escape the whispers. A few even became quietly prosperous. Their lives weren't defined by what they had done to survive, but by the choice to keep living after it. But the cost of that survival is eternal. The site at Donner Lake still stands preserved and somber. Visitors walk through pine trees and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak in quiet tones. Historians argue over the details. Writers still can't leave the story alone because the Donner Party asks questions that history usually avoids. What happens when every option left is the one you swore you'd never choose? What happens when the dream of paradise turns into a snowy tomb? And if survival is all that's left, does it still matter how you achieve it? There are no satisfying answers, just echoes and bones buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that human strength is not measured in glory, but in resolve, not in conquest, but in the brutal, terrible choice to keep breathing, even when every comfort, law, and illusion of civilization has been stripped away. So we remember them not just for what they did, but for what they endured. Not as legends or cautionary tales, but as people, terrified, determined, flawed, and human. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Booyah was not born into royalty. She was born into something far more dangerous. Ambition wrapped in silk. The year was 624 CE, and the Tang dynasty was still young, glowing with promise and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, wealthy enough to provide his daughters with rare privileges, tutors, books, and the radical idea that a girl's mind could be just as sharp as any boy's sword. From an early age, Booyah was different. While her peers learned embroidery and how to pour tea with humility, Wu studied politics, history, and literature. She was fascinated by strategy and stories of imperial rule. She didn't just read about powerful men. She imagined herself among them. By the time she turned 14, her beauty, wit, and education caught the attention of Emperor Tong himself. She was summoned to the imperial palace and became one of the emperor's many concubines. At first glance, it might have seemed like a dead end. After all, she was ranked fairly low, a mere talented lady among dozens, but Wu had no intention of fading into the background. Even in a palace overflowing with silks and whispers, she stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his likes, his moods. She learned the art of silence, of knowing when to speak and when to vanish behind a curtain. But most importantly, she watched. She watched how power was wielded, and more importantly, how it was lost. And when Emperor Tong fell ill, Wu Zhao didn't panic. She planned. Upon his death, she should have been sent to a Buddhist convent. Her life effectively over. But fate, or more accurately, Wu's cunning, had other plans. She had already caught the eye of the emperor's son, Li Jie, the future Emperor Gaozong, and he hadn't forgotten her. What followed was the first in a long string of quiet revolutions. Wu wasn't just a concubine anymore. She was a student of power, and soon she'd be its master. The girl once hidden behind a palace screen would become the woman who ruled from the dragon throne. But her rise had only just begun, and the empire was not ready for what was coming. When Emperor Tong died in 649 CE, palace protocol dictated Wu Yao's next step with chilling clarity. She was to be sent to a convent and live out her days shaved-headed and silent. Most former concubines accepted this fate with quiet resignation. Wu Zhao, however, was not most. Before Tong's death, she had already begun a subtle and dangerous entanglement with his son, Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong. Whether it was genuine affection or ruthless calculation, their bond survived the transition of power. And so, barely a year after entering the convent, Wu Zhao returned, not as a cast-off widow, but as the emperor's secret consort. The Empress Wang, Gaozuong's wife, had ironically orchestrated Wu's return. Hoping to distract the emperor from another rival concubine, she invited Wu Zhou back into the palace. She might as well have handed her the keys to the empire. Wu Zhou played her new role with chilling grace. She bore the emperor's sons, an advantage no rival could match. But she didn't just give him heirs, she gave him ideas. It wasn't long before she became his closest advisor, whispering thoughts that slowly rewrote the gears of state policy and court etiquette. Some said the emperor was in love, others whispered he was bewitched. Either way, she was now indispensable. Then came the blood. The rivalry with Empress Wang and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into quiet war. In 654 CE, tragedy struck, or was orchestrated. Wu Zhao's infant daughter died under suspicious circumstances. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What followed was swift and brutal. Wang and Xiao were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually mutilated. Empress Wang's limbs hacked off and her tongue removed. Her final cries, it was said, were like those of a pig being slaughtered. Wu Zhao was now empress officially. This wasn't a rise. It was a coup disguised as destiny. Wu Zhao had moved from concubine to empress, not with armies, but with alliances, assassinations, and the steady erosion of her enemy's influence. She didn't just survive palace life. She bent it to her will. But she wasn't finished. Not even close. She had tasted power. Now she wanted the throne itself. Not beside the emperor, but above it. And for the first time in China's long and patriarchal history, that unthinkable dream would start to become reality. By the late 1660s, Empress Wu was no longer merely a consort who whispered advice from behind the screen. She had become the empire's silent puppeteer. Emperor Gaozuong's health began to fail, his vision deteriorating, his strength waning. In his weakness, Wu Zhao found opportunity. She stepped forward as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, presiding over court meetings, even reviewing memorials meant for the emperor's eyes only. Ministers knew the truth, but dared not say it. China was now ruled by a woman. At first, Wu Zhao ruled cautiously. She supported Buddhism over the traditional Confucian order, using its doctrines to justify her presence in politics. After all, if the Buddha had once appeared as a woman, why couldn't a woman guide the empire? It was spiritual logic with political teeth. She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit rather than family name. This was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocratic bloodlines. To her supporters, she was a reformer. To her enemies, she was a social arsonist, setting fire to centuries of tradition. Still, Wu played the long game. She never rushed the throne. Instead, she waited, removing rivals, gathering allies, and mastering the language of statecraft. She planted informants like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used the imperial secret police like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed, all while she remained outwardly dutiful to the emperor. In 683, Gaozong died. The natural order should have restored male rule. Their son Zhongzong ascended the throne. But when he showed signs of independence, daring to appoint his in-laws to important positions, Wu Zhao struck. She demoted him and installed another son, Ruiz Zong, one easier to control. Behind the throne, she ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and regent. It was the perfect disguise for authority, a mother protecting the empire in her son's name. But soon, even the fiction of male rule began to chafe. Why hide anymore? The ministers grumbled. The court scribes whispered. China has never had a female emperor, they warned. It would be unnatural. Wu Zhao listened. Then she quietly began to prepare a new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history where the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes, not dragons. She wasn't content to rule from the shadows. She was ready to claim the light. In 690 CE, Wu Zhao finally cast aside the veil. No more proxies, no more sons sitting on the throne with her hand behind their backs. She declared the end of the Tang dynasty and announced the birth of a new regime, the Zhou dynasty, named after a golden age of ancient Chinese history, carefully chosen to evoke legitimacy and virtue. She was no longer Empress Dowager Ya Wu. She was Huangdi Wu Zhao, China's first and only female emperor. The court was stunned. Some scholars recoiled in outrage, citing Confucian texts that spoke of women as obedient, modest, and confined to the inner chambers. But Wu Zhao had already rewritten the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners who owed their rise to her, and crushed dissent before it had time to take root. To reinforce her mandate, she leaned heavily on Buddhism. Temples were built across the empire, proclaiming her as the reincarnation of Matra, the future Buddha. One monk even discovered a scripture declaring that a woman would one day rule the world and bring universal peace. Conveniently, that woman was sitting on the throne. She had portraits painted of herself, seated on the throne with calm authority, and inscriptions carved in stone that praised her as divine monarch. In a patriarchal society, it was nothing short of heresy. And yet, it worked. Wu Zhao governed with a mixture of steel and silk. She strengthened the civil service exam system, ensuring that bureaucrats were chosen by ability, not birthright. She implemented agricultural reforms, lowered burdens on farmers, and increased state revenue. Under her reign, the empire remained largely stable and prosperous. But her power came with a price. She relied on a secret police network that sniffed out dissent like incense smoke in a temple. Court intrigues intensified. Critics disappeared. Rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture chambers circulated like dark incense behind palace walls. Even so, she ruled with an iron grace. She wore the dragon robe. She gave imperial audiences. She issued decrees under her own name. For 15 years, Buya wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She had climbed every rung of a ladder she was never meant to touch. And now she stood alone at the top. Ruling China as its only female emperor brought prestige. But it also made Wu Ya the focal point of every grudge, fear, and wounded ego in the empire. She had rewritten tradition, defied Confucian order, and outmaneuvered generations of noblemen. And that meant one thing. Everyone in silk was watching her and waiting. The court seethed with quiet rebellion. Ministers who bowed by day conspired by candlelight at night. Even among her own children, there was no safety. The sons she had once used as pawns began to resent her absolute control. They wanted power, but Wu had taught them too well how dangerous ambition could be. She trusted none of them to survive. Wu Ao didn't just govern, she played a relentless game of psychological chess. Suspected conspirators were removed under vague charges. Trials were swift, confessions often forced, and executions public. Her enemies painted her as bloodthirsty. But in truth, she was surgical. This wasn't madness, it was method. She created new ranks within the bureaucracy, titles that seemed grand but carried little power. It was her way of rewarding loyalty without handing over real control. She also elevated the status of women at court, placing female relatives and trusted concubines into positions that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Yet, as the years wore on, her reliance on a few key figures began to cast shadows on her legacy. Two favorites in particular, the Zhang brothers, rose from court entertainers to political insiders. Handsome, charming, and decades younger, they quickly earned favor, and with it influence. To her critics, this was scandalous. The emperor, once known for her piercing intellect and ruthless command, was now seen as a lonely woman clinging to youth. Through the company of fawning courtiers, whispers of corruption and decadence began to spread. But those whispers couldn't erase her accomplishments. Under her rule, literacy expanded, civil service exams were reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She hadn't just ruled, she had governed effectively. Still, her health began to decline. Her grip on power, though still firm, was weakening. And behind her, vultures circled, eager for a return to normal, to a throne once again ruled by a man. Wu Ya knew the end was approaching. The only question now was, would it come by illness or betrayal? By the early 700s, Wu Ya was in her 70s, an advanced age for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body grew frail, her strength waned, and yet her mind remained sharp, ever alert to the shifting winds of court politics. She still ruled, but now from a reclining couch behind golden screens, hidden from view, and those closest to her began circling like wolves, sensing weakness. Her reliance on the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Chongzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once charming favorites, they were now viewed as corrupt syphons who manipulated imperial decisions for their own gain. Ministers who had long tolerated their presence began to plot. In 705 CE, the palace finally snapped. A group of senior officials and generals launched a swift coup. It wasn't bloody. It didn't need to be. The empress was surrounded, her allies captured, and the Zhang brothers were summarily executed, their heads displayed to the court as a signal. The phoenix wings had been clipped. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, Wu Zhao had no choice but to abdicate. She was forced to step down and restore her son, Zhongzong, to the throne, the same son she had previously removed for daring to think independently. She retreated into retirement, her once vast court reduced to a small entourage. And yet, even in abdication, she retained her title as emperor and continued to exert some influence behind closed doors. China may have changed the name on its throne, but the echo of Wu Zhao's reign still lingered in every policy, every law, every shaken official, afraid of another woman with ideas. She died later that same year. No grand tomb inscription, no flowery epitaph. Her name was quietly removed from official histories. The Tang dynasty erased her as thoroughly as they could, as if her reign had been a bad dream they preferred not to discuss. But history, like Wu Zhao herself, is difficult to silence. For decades afterward, poets and scholars argued about her. Was she a user or a visionary, a tyrant or a reformer, a murderer or a savior of the state? What is certain is this: she broke every rule the empire tried to write for her. And for 15 years, she didn't just defy history. She became it. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang moved swiftly to erase Wu Zhao's unprecedented reign. Official histories were rewritten. Her reforms were attributed to her male successors. Her name carved into records and temples was scratched out, replaced with safer, more familiar male names. Yet, despite the state's efforts, Buyao refused to vanish. The people remembered her. Scholars couldn't ignore her. Foreign emissaries continued to speak of the female emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth. And in a strange twist of fate, it was the very scholars and historians tasked with minimizing her legacy who ensured its survival. You can erase a name, but not a reign that shaped a generation. Her accomplishments were undeniable. She had elevated Buddhism to new prominence, making it a central pillar of imperial legitimacy. She had restructured the civil service, making exams more meritocratic and reducing aristocratic nepotism. She had defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and kept internal rebellion largely in check, an achievement most male rulers could only hope for. And for women, Buyao's reign was a brief, radiant constellation in a dark sky of subjugation. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and offered unprecedented access to the levers of power. Her rule became a mythic precedent, proof that a woman could not only survive the palace, but dominate it. Still, her legacy is tangled. Later, Confucian historians painted her as a monster in makeup, a femme fatale who seduced her way to power and bathed her court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated, her lovers multiplied, her ruthlessness elevated to near demonic proportions. It was easier to villainize her than to admit she had outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have begun to balance the scales. Today, Wu Zhao is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history, male or female. Her reign, complex and contradictory, remains a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and ideological manipulation. She ruled in a time that said she should be silent. She conquered a system built to crush her, and in the ashes of her erasure, her name still burns. Quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To understand Buyao's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not just through edicts and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule wasn't just a political anomaly. It was a civilizational pivot point. For one, she redefined what it meant to be imperial. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and war generals. Wu Zhao, in contrast, built her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble backgrounds, and fiercely loyal officials who owed their careers to her vision of meritocracy. This fundamentally altered the power structure of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Zhao, the civil service exams became more inclusive and rigorous. This empowered scholars from poorer, non-noble families, a dramatic shift away from the aristocratic monopolies that had dominated since the Han dynasty. In doing so, she laid the groundwork for a more dynamic, educated bureaucracy that would endure long after her death. Culturally, she sparked a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and colossal statues were erected in her name and image. At Longmen Grotto, a massive statue of Vairocana Buddha bears unmistakable features resembling Wu herself, regal, calm, and all-seeing. These were not just religious offerings. They were political monuments. Each structure whispered the same radical message. A woman could embody cosmic order. She also changed the language of rulership. Wuzhou introduced dozens of new Chinese characters into official use, some to express abstract virtues, others designed specifically to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her reign, but the audacity of crafting a new script to describe a new regime speaks volumes about her vision. Perhaps most revolutionary was her manipulation of gender roles. By portraying herself as both mother and sovereign, she fused the intimate and the imperial. She didn't challenge masculinity directly. She absorbed it into her persona. She was at once the nurturing protector and the ruthless enforcer, the dragon and the phoenix, the emperor and the empress. Her empire was not perfect. Dissent was punished harshly. Trust was a rare currency. But it functioned, evolved, and expanded under her. And that despite centuries of resistance to her legacy cannot be denied. Wu Zhao didn't just rule the Tang dynasty, she remodeled it. Wu Zhao died over 2,300 years ago, and yet the echo of her reign still ripples through China's cultural memory. A haunting melody of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. While her name was once scraped from stone and banished from official annals, time has a way of unearthing what history tries to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox. In popular folklore, she was portrayed as everything from a cruel seductress to a divine ruler. Opera troupes dramatized her life, sometimes portraying her as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ruthless tyrant. She was demonized, sanctified, misunderstood, and yet never forgotten. No woman in Chinese history has ever matched her climb or her crown. Others held power as Dowager gauges or regents, but none ever declared themselves emperor. None dared to remake dynasties, rewrite language, or stand alone atop the world's most powerful throne. And the legacy of that fact that she broke the unbreakable rule continues to inspire debate. To some, she remains a cautionary tale. The danger of ambition unbound, of femininity and armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she is something else entirely. A symbol of resilience, a case study in raw political genius, a monument to the cost and consequence of leading when you were never meant to. Even today, Wu Zhao is more than a historical figure. She's a mirror. In her rise, you see the gears of systemic injustice turning, and in her reign, the moment they were jammed. She didn't just defy expectations, she obliterated them. And yet, she also paid the price of greatness. Her legacy remains clouded by moral ambiguity. She used fear as much as fairness. Her enemies died not just in disgrace, but sometimes without trial, their voices lost to history. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic. She was not a saint, but she was never trying to be. Wu Zhao ruled not to be liked but to survive. And in surviving she made history. And so she remains. The woman emperor who rose from the shadows of concubinage, who walked into a world that said no and answered with a throne. In a land of dragons, she crowned herself the phoenix. And in that flame, she burned her name into eternity. In the ancient world, a road wasn't just a convenience. It was a declaration of power. The moment a ruler ordered a road to be carved through forest, desert, or mountain, it wasn't about ease of travel. It was about control. Roads were empire in motion. Unlike rivers or oceans, which nature dictated, roads were human impositions. They cut through geography, tethered distant outposts to capitals, and reminded everyone from merchant to rebel that civilization had reach. A good road meant troops could move fast, taxes could be collected efficiently, and goods from the frontier could be brought to the heart of the empire. The earliest known roads go back to Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. These weren't paved highways, but compacted dirt paths used for carts and trade caravans. Even then, societies realized something crucial. When people move, ideas, goods, and influence move with them, and whoever builds the path controls the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal road stretched over 100 miles from Sardis to Susa. It had way stations, rest areas, and royal couriers who could gallop across the empire in record time. Herodotus claimed a message could travel its full length in just 7 days. That speed wasn't just impressive, it was intimidating. It meant that the king's voice could reach every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But it was the Romans who perfected the road as an imperial instrument. They built over 50,000 meters of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Straight, durable, and astonishingly well-engineered, these roads were designed not for beauty, but for efficiency. Marching legions, grain shipments, imperial messengers, each depended on that stone beneath their feet. Roman roads often started with military purposes in mind, but their civilian impact was just as transformative. Farmers could get their goods to markets. Travelers could cross regions in safety. Cities became linked not just by politics, but by stone and sweat. In every civilization that mattered, the road was never just about transportation. It was about transformation, because to build a road was to reshape the land and with it reshape the power that ruled it. If the ancient world had an engineering superpower, it was Rome. And their greatest tool wasn't just the aqueduct or the arch. It was the road. Roman roads weren't just pathways. They were the bones of an empire. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't metaphorical. It was logistical. The Romans built over 50,000 meters of roads, stone-laid, expertly drained, and arrow-straight. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and more manageable. Roman engineers followed a formula. First, they chose a route, not necessarily the easiest, but often the straightest. Then came surveying using tools like the gramma for right angles and distance. Once the path was set, they began excavation. A Roman road was built in layers like a cake of conquest. The bottom layer statumen was made of large stones. Above that came rudis, a mix of crushed stone and lime. Next was nucleus, a layer of compacted sand or gravel. Finally, the sum dorsum, a paved top of interlocking stone slabs, often crowned in the center for water runoff. The result was a road that could withstand centuries of weather, hooves, and sandals. Some are still in use today, but engineering was only half the story. Roman roads came with infrastructure, mile markers, rest stops, and way stations called manions where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The cursus publicus, Rome's courier system, used these roads to move messages across the empire at astonishing speed, nearly 50 meters a day in some cases. And the roads moved more than mail. They moved legions. A rebellion in Gaul, a skirmish in Judea. Roman troops could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy expected. Roads became an extension of Rome's military muscle, silent, solid, and always advancing. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came cities. Roads encouraged trade, migration, and the spread of Roman law, language, and architecture. They were arteries pumping culture as well as conquest. For Rome, a road wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, a symbol, a message carved in stone that said, "Rome is here." And wherever Rome built, the world changed beneath their feet. While Rome built roads in stone, the Inca Empire built them in the sky. Stretching over 25,000 miles, the Chapak Neon, the great Inca road system, was a marvel of Andean engineering. It tied together one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, connecting deserts, jungles, and mountains that soared past 13,000 feet. And the Inca did it all without the wheel, without draft animals beyond the llama, and without metal tools in the European sense. This wasn't just a road system. It was the spine of an empire. At the heart of it all was Cusco, the Inca capital. Radiating out like spokes on a sunny The roads linked provincial centers, military outposts, agricultural hubs, and sacred sites. The most famous stretch is the Inca Trail, which winds its way to Machu Picchu. But that was just one thread in a vast imperial web. The roads varied in size and construction. In the lowlands, they were wide and paved with stone. In the high mountains, they were narrow paths cut into cliffs, sometimes no more than a foot wide. Where rivers ran, the IMPERIAL built rope suspension bridges using woven grass, strong enough to support travelers and caravans of llamas. These bridges had to be remade yearly, a community ritual that still survives in parts of Peru today. There were no wheeled carts. All transport was by foot or by llama. But the Incas had something even more efficient: chasqui relay runners. These messengers sprinted between tambos or rest stations built every few miles. Messages, food, and even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco within days. This system allowed the empire to function with astonishing speed despite having no written script. But the roads were also spiritual. Many followed segways, sacred lines that radiated from Cusco to shrines and mountains. Travel wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Each step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. The Chapacinian wasn't a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a tether, a way to hold a vertical empire together. From snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts, the roads made unity possible. And though much of it is gone today, some stretches still endure. Stones fitted without mortar, still carrying footsteps after 500 years. The IMPERIAL didn't just conquer the Andes. They stitched it together, one path at a time. Centuries before Rome and far from the Andean peaks, another empire stitched together its vast territory with stone and strategy, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And at its heart ran the Royal Road, a 1,500 meters engineering triumph stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, the Royal Road wasn't just a way to move goods. It was a political artery, a demonstration of imperial sophistication and one of the earliest true long-distance highways in recorded history. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and made them the foundation of bureaucracy. Their engineers scouted routes that balanced terrain with directness, avoiding swamps and scaling mountains when necessary. The result was a surprisingly smooth and fast connection across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus wrote that royal messengers could cross the entire Royal Road in 7 days. A journey that would have taken a regular traveler about 90 days. How? The system of relay stations. Every 15-18 miles there were posting stations with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers would switch horses and continue riding at top speed, a system that prefigured the Pony Express by over 2,000 years. But these roads weren't only for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors used them constantly. The Royal Road helped knit together a multi-ethnic empire that included Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. It made possible something extraordinary in the ancient world: central oversight of distant provinces. Road guards ensured safety and caravans arise provided shelter and provisions. The entire system relied on maintenance and order, two things the Persian bureaucracy excelled at. Road crews were deployed to fix damage and tolls were sometimes collected at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones, tools for measuring distance and ensuring consistency across regions. These practices would echo later in Rome and Byzantium. The Royal Road didn't survive the fall of Persia intact, but its influence lingered. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire. The Romans later expanded upon the concept. Even today, modern highways follow parts of its ancient route. It proved one powerful idea: an empire isn't ruled by sword alone. It's ruled by the speed of a message and the strength of the road it travels. While the Romans were laying stone in Europe and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly building a road network that would shape the world in a different way. Han Dynasty China. Their roads didn't just connect cities. They stitched together a civilization and fueled the rise of one of the most legendary trade systems in human history, the Silk Road. Under the Han Dynasty, especially during the reign of Emperor Wu, R 41 to 87 BCE, roads became a tool for expansion and control. The government poured resources into constructing and maintaining long-distance routes that extended from the imperial capital of Chiang'an into Central Asia. These roads weren't just for merchants. They were vital military and administrative arteries. Unlike Roman roads, Han roads weren't uniformly stone-paved. Many were hard-packed dirt or gravel, occasionally reinforced with planks in muddy regions or stone slabs in hydra areas. But what they lacked in uniform engineering, they made up for in scale and organization. The postal relay system known as the Yichuan was remarkably advanced. Stations were placed at regular intervals, complete with fresh horses and accommodations for government messengers. This allowed imperial decrees and tax records to travel across thousands of miles with surprising speed. These roads supported not just governance but diplomacy and trade. Envoys like Zheng Chen, who journeyed westward into Central Asia, opened up contact with cultures as far as Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flowed outward. In return, China received horses, glassware, and new agricultural ideas. Security was essential. The Han invested heavily in maintaining military garrisons along the routes, especially near the Gansu Corridor, a narrow windswept strip of land that acted as a gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, beacon mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, creating a lattice of imperial presence. Culturally, the road system enabled the spread of Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices across diverse regions. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants moved ideas along with goods, shaping a unified identity that would last long beyond the Han. Han roads weren't built to impress. They were built to endure. And while many vanished beneath later cities or were reclaimed by dust and desert, their legacy remained. Because through these roads, China didn't just defend its borders. It opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks are rarely celebrated for their roads. They didn't build grand highways like the Romans or stretch vast networks like the Persians. But what they did build, though more modest in scale, reveals how roads could shape not only commerce and war, but culture, religion, and identity. Greece's rugged mountainous terrain made road building difficult and expensive. So instead of imperial highways, the Greeks developed a patchwork of stone-paved local routes, often connecting city-states rather than unifying a vast empire. These roads followed natural terrain and were typically narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Yet, despite their simplicity, they played a crucial role in the Greek world. One of the most famous routes was the Sacred Way from Athens to Eleusis, used during the Eleusinian Mysteries, religious festivals dedicated to Dita and Persephone. Each year, thousands of initiates walked this road in a grand procession, chanting hymns and carrying offerings. For them, the road was not just a path, it was a rite of passage, a journey from the world of the living into mystery and transformation. Another iconic route was the Pan-Hellenic Road leading to Delhi, the home of the Oracle of Apollo. Pilgrims, kings, and philosophers alike took this winding road through mountains and valleys to consult the oracle. Along the way were treasuries, shrines, and inscribed stones forming a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads weren't only sacred. They were used by soldiers, philosophers, and traders. Think of Xenophon's Anabasis, describing the long retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal roadbound odyssey. Or imagine Socrates, who often walked from the agora to the academy or the lyceum to teach under the open sky, his feet tracing worn paths of. In ancient Greece, what made roads special was not their construction techniques, but the way they permeated everyday life. Unlike imperial roads, which were often built to show off power, Greek roads formed naturally, intertwined with marketplaces, temples, and social rituals. Along the narrow, dusty lanes that wound through olive groves and city gates, not only soldiers and wagons traveled, but philosophy, theater, democracy, and Olympic athletes also spread. Though simple, those roads carried the weight of a civilization that changed the world, not with swords, but with ideas. In ancient India, roads were not just trade routes, but also spiritual lifelines, imperial governance, and cultural exchange. From the Maurya dynasty in the 3rd century BC to the Gupta period that followed, Indian civilizations developed highly organized road networks that connected fertile plains, ports, trading towns, and holy cities. The most dramatic transformation of ancient Indian transport took place under the Emperor Ashoka, a Buddhist king who ruled much of the subcontinent from 268 to 232 BC. After abandoning violence after the bloody Kalinga War, he turned to a social welfare policy, in which roads played a central role. Ashoka's roads were not just red dirt paths, but well-planned itineraries, with shade trees, wells, and rest houses for travelers. He also erected stone pillars engraved with edicts along the roads, not to measure distances, but to propagate the values of compassion, honesty, and religious tolerance, a form of visual governance. The most famous route stretched from the capital Pataliputra, now Patna, to the northwestern frontier, a vital corridor connecting the Gangetic Plain with what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. It later became part of the northern trade route that became the Silk Road, linking India with China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world. These routes were not only routes of goods, but also routes of faith and knowledge. Buddhist monks preached on foot, Hindu pilgrims visited sacred rivers and temples, and sages walked silently, contemplating the world. Roads became bridges between ideas. From the eastern seaboard, goods such as spices, silks, ivory, and precious stones were transported inland and exported to Roman ports or Central Asian markets. Roads linked urban centers such as Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, hubs of commerce and learning. Though not paved like Roman roads, ancient Indian roads were maintained seasonally, especially before the monsoon. Engineers used gravel, wooden planks, and compacted earth, often raising the road slightly to avoid flooding. The big difference was not in the materials but in the philosophy. This road system served kings, peasants, saints, and scholars. It connected not just empires, but worldviews. And through its diversity of goals, political, spiritual, and economic, India built not just roads, but corridors of influence far beyond its borders. Ancient road engineering. Symbols of wisdom and power. Ancient roads were not simply flat paths stretched across the ground. They were engineering feats that crossed deep rivers, valleys, and rugged terrain. To build them effectively, civilizations had to master bridge construction, drainage, and durable materials. The Romans were masters of bridge building, using stone arches to cross large rivers. Bridges such as the Ponte Milvio in Rome or the Alcantara Bridge in Spain are clear examples. Roman arches used precisely cut stones, joined together with a central lock, distributing weight perfectly, both strong and imposing, demonstrating the power of the empire. But Rome was not alone. The Incas, faced with fast-flowing rivers in the canyons of the Andes, invented suspension bridges made of woven grass and vines, light, durable, and recreated by the people every year as a communal ritual. Crossing this bridge is not only a physical challenge, but also a symbol of community and nature. In ancient China, engineers built girder and pontoon bridges. The famous Jiaozhou Bridge, completed in 605 during the Sui dynasty, is the oldest surviving open stone segmental arch bridge. It is both beautiful in form and extremely strong, allowing traffic to cross the Jing River for centuries. Drainage is also important. Roman roads were built high in the middle to allow rainwater to drain quickly into the ditches. In rainy regions such as India and Southeast Asia, roads were often raised or paved with multiple layers of gravel to prevent mud. Some empires even built roads with multiple layers of compacted earth, stone, gravel, and paving to ensure durability. Rest stations, milestones, and inns were also built along the way, the precursors to modern highway stations. These techniques not only made travel possible, but also shaped economics, warfare, and culture. A bridge can decide the fate of an army. A good road can save a city through trade and communication. The legacy of ancient roads. Over time, ancient roads became the lifeblood of empires. They connected distant cities and remote villages, opened the way for trade, spread ideas, and shaped cultures. Without roads, armies could not move, officials could not enforce laws, and merchants could not thrive. The Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, or the Inca Capac Ñan transported more than goods, but also ideas, identities, and civilizations. Maintaining a road system required a sophisticated bureaucracy and a large workforce, a reflection of the organizational capabilities of empires like the Romans, Persians, Chinese, and Incas. When roads were well maintained, empires prospered. When neglected, the land falls into isolation and decay. But roads are also symbols of human ambition, to connect, control, and communicate across vast spaces. Ancient engineers and leaders understood that geography was not a barrier,